I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Today, I'm releasing 4 brand new episodes of Parallax Views back to back as part of a special fundraising push to keep the show going strong. Each episode represents the kind of deep dive, thought-provoking content you've come to expect from the program. This mega drop isn't just a content dump, it's a statement. Independent media matters, and your support makes it possible. If Parallax Views has challenged your thinking, exposed you to new ideas, or simply kept you company on your commute, now's the time to help sustain it. Listen, share, and if you can, support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you want, you can also make a one-time donation by contacting me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I can give you a link to my PayPal page if you contact me that way. Let's show what listener-supported media can do. With that out of the way, on this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from returning guests and a regular on this program, our Middle East correspondent, James Dorsey. Audio on this one has a little bit of crackle. I tried to fix it in post, but there was only so much I could do. Nonetheless, I think this is an informative conversation that you should hear. We're going to be talking about the Iran-Israel ceasefire, which James says is more a halt to hostilities rather than a ceasefire. Listen to the conversation, you'll find out why he says that. We'll also talk about the Gulf states and Israel's emasculation strategy in dealing with its neighbors and the region, and how the Gulf states are perceiving that. All that and much more in the conversation to follow with James Dorsey of the Turbulent World Substack and blog, covering all the latest developments in the Middle East. Let's get right to it with James Dorsey. Welcome back to Parallax Views. James M. Dorsey of the Turbulent World blog. How are you doing? And maybe you could give your initial thoughts on the halt of hostilities between Iran and Israel.
I'm doing well. Good to be with you, JG. This is a halt of hostilities rather than a ceasefire. In other words, the Iranian position on this has been, we will stop. We didn't start this war for starters. We will halt it. We will stop our retaliation against Israel the minute Israel stops its attacks on Iran. U.S. President Trump obviously convinced Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to stop it after 12 days, and the Iranians in return have halted their fire. The problem here is that it's very fragile. The Israelis reserve the right to strike at Iran whenever they deem it necessary. There are no terms to this halt to the hostilities. The prospects for a negotiated settlement are dim. Trump has basically said we're going to meet the Iranians next week. The Iranians have not confirmed that, but Trump has at the same time said it doesn't really matter. We don't need an agreement. We've obliterated the program. In other words, he's sort of said, what's there to discuss? That implicitly is an extension of his negotiating tactic, which is essentially, I'm telling you, Iran, what to do. You're going to do it. And if you don't do it, you pay a very heavy price. That's a tactic that has been tried for 46 years with the Iranians, ever since the Islamic Republic was founded in 1979. And it's never worked. And there's no indication that it's going to work this time.
So I want to get back to that point you made that it hasn't worked, but what are we to make of I know we've talked about this off air, but a lot of people are wondering now how much damage has been done to these nuclear sites that were hit, or to Fordow specifically. Um, and I think that's an open question. Although I would say I don't think Trump's claim of complete obliteration is true, based on what I'm seeing from various experts um, and commentators. I don't. What do you think, though?
The degree of damage that was inflicted is the $64,000 question. The Iranians admit that their program was badly damaged, badly being their word, but they haven't given any detail of what that means. And we're left with more questions than we have answers. So in other words, we don't know how much of the program was above board and how much was below board. That's, of course, something that is known to the International Atomic Energy Agency and probably to other authorities. We don't know um, how much of that program has been salvaged. In other words, the Iranians knew this was coming. It was not a question of if, it was a question of when. And they, without doubt, would have prepared for that, including taking out uh, the 401.8 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity. And so I think it's a fair assumption to make that at least uh, part of that uranium has been salvaged. The last time that the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors who are in Iran saw that the uranium stockpile was on the 28th of March, and they saw it at 28th of May, and they saw it at Ferdo. That doesn't mean um, that it was in Ferdo at the moment that the United States struck. Also, we don't know the degree. Part of the program was underground. We do know that, but we don't know how far underground it was. There are estimates. It could have been further underground than the strikes, than the U.S. bunker busting bombs reach. On the other hand, I think you've also got to keep in mind that centrifuges are very fragile, and so it may not need a direct hit to at least put some of them out of operation.
So I'm going to reiterate this here, and do you think that there's probably truth to saying that Trump has exaggerated more than a bit when saying it was a complete obliteration?
I think there's no doubt that he overstated. Now, beyond the fact that Trump tends to overstate by definition, and like superlatives, I think one also has to realize that Trump is not. It's not all that easy a position for him. He needs the situation, whether that's in an agreement or whether that's facts on the ground, that is substantially different from the 2015 international agreement that curbed Iran's nuclear program, from which he walked away. If he doesn't have something substantially different, then the question, of course, arises, why did you walk away and create a very fragile and very dangerous situation by abrogating the agreement at a moment that everybody agreed that Iran was adhering to it?
I'm curious. I had Ori Goldberg on recently, who I believe has also spoken with you. You've interviewed him before. And I think Ori's take on Trump is that Trump is kind of tired of all this and may even be tired of Netanyahu. I sort of share that view. I think Trump isn't that interested in foreign policy. I think he has a lot of things he wants to do at home, domestically here in the US. And I almost feel like he just wants this to all end with Israel and Iran so he can focus on things here. What's your sort of feel for Trump right now?
Well, I think that Trump's priorities, without question, are domestic, but he can't avoid foreign policy. And the Middle East is a headache. It's a headache. It's not just Iran, it's Gaza. There are multiple issues playing here. And I think he does have a direct interest in the Middle East, certainly in the Gulf states. given that they're financially very powerful. They're also strategic in many ways, and
In some ways,
therefore, and
not
that's why
not
he.
not to interrupt you, but I sometimes feel that people focus so much on the like Israel lobbying and APAC that they forget how close Trump is with the Gulf states.
That's true, but keep something else in mind. No country has a grassroots movement, a grassroots support base in the United States like Israel does. And that's not the Jewish community, it's the Christian community. And that's a community that's very much part of his base. Um, and so uh, Israel, even if, in a lot of ways, the Gulf has what Trump is interested in, Israel is something that he cannot avoid. Let's keep in mind that Netanyahu is the only head of government who, since Trump came to office, has been in Washington twice and potentially could be coming a third time.
So, in terms of what I was asking, and I felt like I interrupted you with the Gulf states thing. I guess to me, I almost feel like Trump said, "Okay, we attacked Fort Dow. It's over now, and now I can go back to what I really want to be doing, which is, immigration, all this other stuff." It's almost like he was searching for a way out.
Well, no, I think that's a little bit oversimplified.
Okay, okay.
And the reason that I think it's oversimplified is that his focus in the Middle East is in many ways, or what he would like to focus on, are the Gulf states. But the Gulf states are telling him, you need to resolve this. And with $3.6 trillion on the table investment, that's a very powerful request.
How much money did you say was on the table?
3.6 trillion,
Wow.
over a number of years. But it's basically the 1.2 roughly over three Gulf states. So 1.2 for the Saudis, 1.2 for the Emiratis, 1.2 for the Qataris.
So this is all very much a headache, especially for the Gulf states, and that shouldn't be overlooked, is what you're saying.
Absolutely. I mean, look, there's right now you've got a buzz. I think it may be a Fata Morgana, but nonetheless, you've got a buzz about a Gaza ceasefire. Uh, the deal that is being put together, which I think is totally unrealistic at this point, um, is that the Israelis would agree to a ceasefire uh, with various conditions. As part of that deal, the United States would recognize limited sovereignty of Israel in the West Bank. That would allow um, Netanyahu to make some vague statement on a Palestinian state, and that in turn would lead to recognition of Israel by Saudi Arabia, potentially Syria, other Muslim and Arab states. Um, I don't think that's a formula that's going to work, and I don't think that that's how it's going to be put together. But not only does it cater to, as a matter of principle, even though the Saudis and others would not buy into a deal that legitimizes Israeli occupation of Arab lands, Palestinian lands in this case. Um, it does meet, it is a formula that meets Trump's agenda. He want beyond all the economic and domestic stuff, he wants an expansion of the number of countries recognizing the state of Israel. He wants to be, he started that with United Arab Emirates and with Bahrain and Morocco in his first term in office. He's always wanted the Saudis and others to join, hasn't been successful in that. But that remains still something that he would like to see. Whether or not that's because he then thinks he would qualify for a Nobel Peace Prize, being neither here nor there. It's something that he attributes importance to.
When you say Fata Morgana, you mean so you're saying it's like a mirage or an illusion, this idea that there's going to be a ceasefire.
Exactly. I mean, there's no way that Hamas is going to, or any of the Arab states are going to agree to be part of an agreement that legitimizes uh, Israeli sovereignty over territories conquered in 1967 during the Middle East War. So I think it's a fata morgana in that sense. I don't think that even if, and Netanyahu has proven this, even if Netanyahu were to come out with some statement that seemed to endorse a Palestinian state, whether or not he breaks up his coalition by doing so, in the belief that he's riding high at the moment and potentially could win an election or emerge as the largest political party that puts together a new coalition. Uh, I don't see that there's a common ground uh, on the basis of which that could be achieved.
I was wondering if we could delve into this a little bit more because one I would consider it a mistake that some people make is I think there's this mistake of certain parties trying to conflate the interests of Gulf states and various other Arab states with the interests of Israel, or this idea that, I mean, some people go as far as to say that all these corrupt Gulf states have just become puppets of Israel, and I actually think that's not true. Um, Maybe you could speak a little bit more to
Well,
that because I think the Gulf states have different interests
I
than
mean,
Israel in a lot of ways.
the notion of puppets, I think, is baloney. What I do think is that Gulf and others' perceptions of Israel have changed. So at the time, if you go back to the time of the 2015 international agreement on Iran, the Gulf states saw an alliance with Israel against Iran as their interest. That has changed. First of all, that was a period where you had multiple uh, rivalries dominating the Middle East between Turkey, Iran, the Gulf states, differences between the Gulf states. That changed. Saudi Arabia and Iran reestablished diplomatic relations in 2021.
Is that you're
Those
talking
relations have
about
been
the Saudi Iran rapprochement that the China
right,
brokered, right? Yeah.
right. Basically, Saudi Arabia and Iran had broken off relations in 2016 after Saudi diplomatic missions in Iran were ransacked in response to the execution of a prominent Saudi Shiite Muslim religious figure. Uh, by 2021, you had a situation where all the Gulf states, or even all the Middle Eastern states, except for Israel, maybe, were trying to freeze their differences, recognizing that they couldn't resolve them, but freeze them so that there was no escalation, so that they could be managed, and focus on the areas where they could cooperate. And so um, the Gulf posture towards Iran changed. On top of that, what the war has done, coupled with with Lebanon, with Syria, and now with Iran, has changed perceptions of Israel. Israel has a much more aggressive stance. It's fundamentally changed its uh, defense doctrine from deterrence to emasculation.
You
And
said that
as
before. Did you
such,
mean the Israel Iran skirmish or the war between Israel and Iran?
yeah, well, Israel, Iran, the Gaza war is what I meant.
Okay, okay. I'm
So
sorry.
during the last 21,
Yeah.
yeah, sorry. So Israel's changed its defense doctrine for all practical matters since October 7, 2023, the Hamas attack on Israel. If in the past it was deterrence, a sledgehammer approach, ensuring military superiority, it's now emasculation. You've seen that with Hamas. You've seen that with Hezbollah. You've seen that with post Assad Syria. And you've seen that with the Israeli strikes at Iran. And as such, um, uh, Gulf perceptions of Israel have changed. In other words, could they be next?
I'm curious because I've wondered about that myself. You know, in the past, Netanyahu, I mean, to be honest, I think he's always been a bit more cautious. And that seems to have changed, especially since October 7th. I think the mowing the lawn sort of strategy is not something they're doing anymore. I think this is like, as you said, emasculation. Why has that change happened with regards to Israeli policy?
I think October 7 really was a traumatic experience for the Israelis. This was the first time that uh, an enemy force had basically breached the border, been able to enter Israel, occupy towns and centers, and slaughter people. This is unprecedented. I mean, unless you go back to pre-state days, um, this is unprecedented. And as a result, Israel's changed in a lot of different ways, not necessarily for the better, and not without a price that they're going to have to pay sometime down the line.
You also mentioned earlier the 67 borders. Why is that for someone, if I have listeners that are new to all of this, because I always have listeners that are just trying to learn, why are the 67 borders so key when it comes to any sort of a acceptable solution to this, at least in the eyes of these Arab states?
Every effort since 1967, up until Trump, to resolve the Israeli Palestinian conflict, or the Israeli Arab conflict for that matter, was based on Israel returning to its borders, pre 1967 borders. So, 1967, the Israelis occupied Egypt's Sinai Desert, Syria's Golan Heights, the West Bank, which was Jordanian at the time, and Gaza, which was Egypt. In that dividing has always been the basis of uh, of peace efforts, and the basic underlying principle of all of those, now what, almost 5 decades or 6 decades of peacemaking or failed peacemaking, was that Israel would withdraw to the pre 1967 borders, and the deal would be based on the exchange of land for peace. That is something that Netanyahu has now fundamentally changed. The other thing that happened post 1967, that is that essentially, primarily the Jordanians, but also the Egyptians, ceded their claims to territories occupied by Israel in 1967, i.e., the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, to the Palestine Liberation Organization, or to as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. So, with other words, going forward, these lands were not no longer viewed as Jordanian or Egyptian; they were viewed as Palestinian, and basically being the basis for a two-state solution in which they would create a Palestinian state alongside Israel.
I also wanted to go back to something you said earlier about the sort of strategies that have been used against Iran by the US in the past, decades haven't worked. For people unfamiliar with that history, can you speak to that? Well, why haven't the strategies worked?
Well, first of all, let's keep in mind is Iran is its own worst enemy. Within a year of less than a year of the Iranian Revolution, you had the occupation of the U.S. embassy in Tehran, just as an example, and the embassy was held for 444 days. So, uh, Islamic Republic Iranian U.S. relations got off to a bad start from the beginning. Uh, Iran, if you look at what Khomeini, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic, what his positions were, one of his most important positions was not religious, it was geopolitical. It was the independence of Iran. And that has to do with Iranian perceptions of their own history, which goes back to the 1940s when the country was occupied and divided by the Russians and the Brits. It goes back to the 1953 coup, which overthrew Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. He was overthrown by the father of the current Shah. It was an Iranian military overthrow after a U.S. and he had the backing of the United States and Britain, but the U.S. and Britain had shortly before that tried a coup of their own and it failed. So you have a long history of problematic relations with big powers, and you have a history of which Iranians pride themselves of struggling for independence. And that's a history that's flown over into the Islamic Republic and shapes what the Islamic Republic is as much as it shaped what Iran was before the Islamic Revolution.
Does the does Saddam also figure into that? What I mean is, I mean, there was U.S. backing for Saddam Hussein. Does that also sort
Sure,
of linger in the memory of Iranians?
absolutely, absolutely. I mean, look, Iran's view of the world is one in which it is encircled by U.S. bases and by countries aligned with the United States. Um, there's been on and off attempts to instigate social unrest in Iran through ethnic minorities, for example, the Kurds, the Baloch, the Azeris. Keep in mind that Iran is a multi-ethnic society. It's not a Persian society as such. Um, so all of these factors play into that and sort of reconfirm that perception of history.
So on one hand, you said you were saying Iran has been its own worst enemy. Have there been missteps though by the U.S. in trying to deal with Iran as well? I mean, maybe you can give a breakdown of where both sides sort of their perceptions shape what ends up happening. You know.
Look, I think there have been misperceptions all along. Just take the 2015 international agreement. Uh, Trump walked away from it, declaring this was the worst agreement, whatever. Um, Netanyahu was obviously very happy with that. He disliked that agreement strongly. The Iranians wanted the Americans to return to that agreement. What the Americans did, particularly under Biden, try and use uh, the walk away, Trump's walk away, to expand the agreement, to start bringing into it the issues of um, ballistic missiles, the issues of Iran's non-state allies. And the Iranians said, we're not going to talk about it. We had an agreement. You walked away from it. You're serious? You return to it. I think it was a failure to not return to it, as was, and then build the confidence to be able to talk about um, other things. Keep also in mind that the strategy, uh, that ballistic missiles and the strategy of having non-state allies was a forward defense strategy. Um, Iran, for all practical matters, because of the sanctions and long-standing sanctions, doesn't have an air force to speak of. It doesn't have a navy to speak of. It has ground forces. They're of no use against Israel because Israel and Iran don't have a border, and neither country is capable of invading the other. And so what it's left with is ballistic missiles which has been very successful with um, non-state allies, which have a forward defense strategy that has been severely undermined in the last 21 months with the invasion of Gaza, the decimation of Hezbollah, the fall of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Um, so, uh, those sanctions have worked, and even so, Iran hasn't buckled.
What has made Iran so adaptable over these decades? And what do you think of people warning now that I think Trita Parsi and a few others have been saying that, this makes Iran more likely to try to rebuild its nuclear sites and pursue uh, nuclear capabilities in terms of weaponry?
Well, there's several things here. First of all, let's be clear, Iran has paid a heavy price. Its economy has suffered severely, not just because of sanctions, but also because of sanctions. It also suffers from widespread corruption, from economic mismanagement. Um, the argument, uh, the argument, the argument that Iran may be more likely to go nuclear is a fair argument. I think you've also got to keep in mind how Iran got to the 60% enrichment. When Trump walked away from the agreement in 2018, Iran continued to adhere to the agreement for another year in the hope that its track record in adhering to that agreement would persuade the Americans to return to it. When that didn't work, it tried to increase the leverage by gradually walking away from the adherence to provisions of the agreement. And that included enrichment, which is how it got to 60%. Um, it was not, it's clear that the initial intent was not to enrich to a degree that it would build a nuclear weapon or that it had the intent of building a nuclear weapon. But we don't live in a static world. For many Iranians, uh, both in office, in power, but also at a popular level, nuclear makes sense as a deterrent. Their ballistic missiles is what they're left with in deterrence, and they need to try and establish a new line of deterrence. In a sense, they're encouraged by the Russians. Not that the Russians are telling the Iranians build a nuclear weapon. They're not. On the contrary, they don't want to see a nuclear weaponized Iran. But increasingly, nuclear deterrence has become fashionable again, and it's become fashionable with Vladimir Putin's threat to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And that threat, already early on, was what persuaded the United States, Europe, NATO to carefully calibrate the support that they offered Ukraine because they didn't want to provoke that. So, with other words, what the Iranians have seen in Ukraine is that nuclear deterrence works.
I wanted to ask you, in terms of looking at Iran as an actor on the international stage and within the region, the common pushback I hear from people whenever I try to talk about this is, and this is particularly coming from right wingers, they always say, "Do you really want the mad mullahs of Iran to have a nuke?" And I'm not looking at it as whether they should or shouldn't, but I don't think the Matt Mullah's argument is very helpful. I think Iran would seek nuclear capabilities for the same reason Israel does, to be honest, or has. I mean, it's
Well,
deterrence.
well, first of all, I don't think the mullahs are mad. I think they're rational players,
But yeah, there's a sort
and
of
you
the Mad Mullahs thing. I think is a very racist. Well, we don't have to get into that, but yeah.
leave that aside. I think you're deceiving yourself if you try and write them off as mad. Second of all, don't forget that the nuclear program was not started by the Islamic Republic. It was started by the Shah, and the Shah had regional ambitions. He was very clear about that. Uh, and third of all, I mean, clearly, ideally, you would want a nuclear-free Middle East because the threat that you have is that you're going to see a nuclear arms race. Certainly, if Iran were to decide to go for a nuclear weapon, you're going to see the Saudis wanting a nuclear weapon. You're going to see the Turks wanting a nuclear weapon. Um, on top of that, don't forget what never or seldom is brought up in discussion is the Middle East already has a nuclear power, and that's Israel. It's never officially admitted that it has nuclear weapons. It's not a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, yet it has nuclear weapons. And again, if your perceptions of Israel change in terms of its posture as an aggressive regional player, the fact that it has nuclear weapons is something that other countries are going to take on board.
Before we start closing out, what are the flashpoints you think people should be focusing on right now if their eyes are on the Middle East?
Well, Gaza is one, and Palestine, of course. Iran is the other, without doubt. I mean, we're not talking about other wars going on, Sudan, for example. But the two major flashpoints are Gaza, Palestine, is Israel, obviously, and Iran. And they're even if you get a ceasefire today in Gaza, that's going to be a very fragile situation for a long time to come.
In terms of what do you see as the big risks right now in the Middle East?
Look, I think the risks are that you don't start tackling root problems. You don't start tackling an equitable, fair resolution of the Palestinian problem. If you have a state that basically believes it has the right to strike whenever it wants, wherever it wants, against a perceived threat, you've got a problem. With other words, much of the world lives in states that are bordered by states that are heavily armed. Imagine that you would get the Israeli example uh, repeated elsewhere. A major regional power starts emasculating its neighbors. It's a jungle. And so, unless you start
It's sort
addressing
of
these
it's
things,
might makes right. Yeah.
yeah, it's might makes right, exactly. And that works for a period of time, but also creates incredible risks and dangers and problems. And so, unless you start addressing these fundamental issues, it's going to be very difficult to control.
That goes back to something you said in one of your recent posts. You wrote, "It's not because of a lack of effort, but because the assumption underlying the push to end Israel's devastating 21-month long assault on the Strip in response to Hamas' October 7th, 2023 attack on Israel are problematic." Can you explain that a little bit more?
So, with other words, the push on to end the war is premised on well, it's premised on the assumption that Hamas is and that the Gaza has suffered to a degree that they will have no choice but to cave, and there's no indication of that. The I mean, the Americans apparently, when Ron Dermer, the Israeli Minister of Strategic Affairs, and a Netanyahu confidant, is in Washington in the coming couple of days, I was apparently going to say to him, look, Hamas can be dealt with later. It's been weakened enough. And, on that premise, try and get Netanyahu, persuade Netanyahu to agree to a ceasefire. The problem with it is that Hamas has shown flexibility on a number of issues, the number of hostages to be released, uh, uh, the dates that they will be released, the how long the initial phase of a ceasefire would last. But Hamas has not surrendered on the basic uh, position that any temporary ceasefire has to be integrally linked to a permanent ceasefire. And that, if anything, that demand has been strengthened by the fact that Israel violated the ceasefire in March when it restarted hostilities in Gaza. So that's the Palestinian position, the Hamas position, and on the other hand, you have the Israeli position that this war is going to continue until we have destroyed politically and militarily Hamas, which they haven't been able to do in 21 months. And so that's what I'm saying. What I mean when I'm saying it's based on false assumptions, that gap may have narrowed. There's no indication of that.
In terms of Gaza, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this or if you think it's a distraction, but should there be any focus on the sort of rival groups to Hamas in Gaza? I've had people say that I should be covering things like the Abu Shabab clan more. Uh, do you think that these sort of rival groups are going to play a role in Gaza going forward? I mean, or could they, I guess?
Well, I think first of all, define rival groups. The first and foremost rivalry is the rivalry between Hamas and the Palestine Authority. And by and large, there is agreement that the authority is problematic, it's corrupt, it's ineffective, it needs reform. But there's also, by and large, agreement, with the exception of Israel, that the Palestine Authority is the address you should be going to. That's the address that should be taking over if and when you have a halt to the hostilities in Gaza. Uh, you know, Groups like Abu Shabab are essentially Israeli-backed groups. What the Israelis would, Netanyahu rejects the notion of any um, any Palestinian entity or that is nationalist in character or any Palestinian expression of national aspirations. They essentially want an administration, if it is Palestinian, that is submissive and subjects itself to uh, Israeli policies. The Abu Shabab group, that's what it does. Uh, and so, therefore, would the Israelis want to see like Abu Shabab being part of it? Possibly. But I don't think that that's a realistic thought.
I also have to ask, what do you make of the potential issues with Syria and Israel making a deal, what this means for the Golan Heights, and so on?
Well, again, I think that the Syrians, as a matter of principle, if certain conditions are met, would want to would be willing to recognize Israel. That's assuming you have an end to the Gaza war, you have a legitimate uh, post-war administration. The Israelis are committed to the creation of a Palestinian state. But it's very hard to see that any Syrian government would relinquish its claims to the Golan Heights, which were Syrian and were occupied in 1967.
And I guess finally here, the last thing I wanted to touch upon was Netanyahu being the sort of cat with nine lives in Israel. Um, Do you think he could survive with a new coalition?
Look, uh, Netanyahu is a cat with nine lives. You underestimate him at his peril. He's a master politician, and he has no scruples. His, he his popularity has gone up, certainly with the Iran, uh, with the Iran war. That was something that overwhelmingly was supported by the Israeli population, and Israel performed militarily in Iran brilliantly. One has to be clear about that, and that has, in a lot of ways, enhanced his. He was down in the boondocks in terms of his popularity. Today, he's doing well. Not in the polls, not enough to uh, to to win an election and form a government on his own, but certainly enough to win an election and be the one who puts together a coalition. The question mark is, and that was part of his problem in the last couple of rounds. The question is, how many are going to be willing to work with him? He's proven to be a very problematic prime minister. So, yes, I would not underestimate him, and I wouldn't rule it out.
And going back to what you said about Netanyahu viewing any sort of Palestinian nationalism as unacceptable, how would you explain that to someone who's trying to understand the Israeli mindset? Why is Israel so afraid of any type of Palestinian national aspirations? Because one person described it to me as for many figures in Israel politically, it's not enough for Palestinians to accept Israel's existence. It's that they can't really dream of their own national aspirations. Why are so many in Israel opposed to national aspirations? Is there sort of a fear that it will evolve into sort of the destruction of Israel by Palestinians if that happens, or
Well, first of all, I think that uh, certainly pre October 7, there was a substantial body of Israelis who were not opposed to a two-state solution. Now, they may have had a somewhat different understanding from the Palestinians what that meant in terms of whether or not the Palestinian state could be militarized or not, what Israeli rights would be, and so on. But fundamentally, there was an agreement, or there was a significant body of Israelis that endorsed the concept of a two-state solution. I think the faith in that solution has been severely undermined by the October 7 attack. Um, but so you have fundamentally two sets of attitudes towards the notion of a Palestinian state. You have the added you have the notion of where security comes in, and that's a double-edged argument. With other words, does a Palestinian entity form a threat to Israel, or could it form a threat to Israel, or is the absence of a Palestinian state and a resolution of Palestinian national aspirations, is that a threat that will be continuous to the Jewish state? That's one set of issues. But then you have those who see um, the West Bank, or even Gaza for that matter, and potentially other territories, as part of what is the Jewish homeland. And so their claim to the land is not a practical claim or a security claim, it's an ideological claim. And that's represented by the ultra nationalists, who are very influential.
I'm not trying to draw this out, but I also, and you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but I think you're familiar with his work and you may have even had an encounter with him or two. I was curious. What do you think of Zbigniew Brzezinski's, the late Zbigniew Brzezinski's views on Israel, especially in his latter years, and some of his fears that he had about how Israel was approaching things? Because I've been rereading his work, and I know you're familiar with his work, and I feel like he was prophetic in a lot of ways.
He was. I mean, look, he was and he wasn't. He was also the man who said bye bye PLO. And decades later, it's not bye bye the PLO. But in his latter years, he was prophetic. I mean, he basically was one of America's 20th century uh, greatest strategists. You know, potentially with Henry Kissinger and Brent Scowcroft. There's no
He's a
doubt about it.
fascinating figure, whether people like him or not.
Right. And there's a biography of him that was just published in the last month or two, which I haven't read yet, but will read, but has gotten very good reviews. No, I think that uh, he clearly saw the problems with Israel. I'm not saying that he was not empathetic to Israel, but he certainly had a more clear-eyed view of Israel.
What do you think he got most right, if people don't know what we're referring to?
In terms of look, I think he basically was essentially saying Israel is its own worst enemy, or could be its own worst
They're
enemy, and
self-immolating their own reputation almost, I think was his view.
and we're seeing that now. I mean, the damage that Israel has done to itself with questionable upside is immense. I don't think Israelis realize just how damaging the last 21 months have been.
Well, I want to thank you again, James Dorsey, for coming on Parallax Views. How can my listeners keep up with your work? And as always, what's the one takeaway you want my folks to get when listening to this? Other
I
than we're
would say
all
stay
doomed and
tuned.
it seems like things are kind of a mess.
Well, what I would say is stay tuned to the Parallax View and the Turbulent World. Listeners can subscribe to my newsletter at jamesmdorsey.substack.com. There's a free subscription. If you're interested and capable, I need all the support I can, and would love to see you become paid subscribers.
This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, WV, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Darko, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mark M, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Saded 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.